I'm sitting on the curb 2 blocks away from my house with exactly $4 in my pocket, and everything I've owned for 15 years is stuffed into 3 trash bags that are currently getting soaked in the rain. My mother just called the cops on me when I tried to open the front door with my key, and she screamed through the intercom that I'm no longer her daughter because I'm a selfish brat who won't help her own family. If someone had told me 30 days ago that I'd be in this position, I would have laughed in their face. My mom and I were best friends. But exactly 1 month ago, Mark entered our lives, and that was the beginning of the end. It all started on a random Tuesday. Mom came home glowing, saying she'd met the one. I was happy for her, honestly. My dad left when I was 5 and only left behind a small insurance settlement that was sitting in a trust fund for my college. Mom always told me that money was my ticket to a real life. But Mark was the kind of guy who fills up every inch of a room the second he walks in. He moved in after only a week of dating. At first, he was nice, bringing home pizza, asking how school was going. Then he accidentally lost his job at a construction firm that, I'm now realizing, probably only existed in his head. By the second week of this happy cohabitation, the vibe in the house shifted. Mom became jumpy. She started looking over my shoulder at my phone and asking exactly how much was in that college account. I didn't get why she was asking until I overheard them talking in the kitchen late at night. Mark was convincing her that they needed to invest in some insane startup flipping used cars, and the only thing stopping them from becoming millionaires was a lack of seed money. Mom tried to push back at first, saying it was Chloe's money, my money, but Mark just systematically broke her down. He told her if they didn't take the risk now, they'd be counting pennies in this dump for the rest of their lives. I walked into the kitchen right then and told them straight up, no. I told them that money is my future, my chance to get out of here and become a vet. You should have seen Mark's face. He wasn't even mad. He just looked at me with this condescending smirk, like I was a cranky toddler who didn't understand how the world works. And Mom, for the first time in my life, she wouldn't look me in the eye. She just stared at her coffee mug and whispered that I needed to stop being so selfish and think about our new family. From that day on, the house went dead silent. Mom stopped making breakfast. She stopped asking about my day. Every time I walked into a room, she and Mark would stop talking immediately. I felt like an intruder in my own home. Mark started making up rules. I had to be home by 6 p.m., and I couldn't use the Wi-Fi after 9 p.m. because it wasted electricity, which we all know is total BS. He just wanted to show me who was boss. The worst part was that Mom just nodded along to everything. She became a shadow of herself, doing whatever he wanted. A week after that conversation, I tried to log into my banking app and realized my password didn't work. My blood went cold. My hands were shaking as I tried to reset it, but the system kept giving me errors. It turns out that since Mom was a co-signer on the account until I turned 18, she just changed all the recovery info. I lost it that night. I screamed until I was hoarse. I called Mark a thief and Mom a traitor. You know what she did? She slapped me. For the first time in my life. She told me if I ever opened my mouth like that toward Mark again, I shouldn't bother coming home. I locked myself in my room and cried all night. I couldn't believe the person who raised me could just erase my entire future for a guy she'd known for less than a month. But that was just the start. I didn't know Mark had already planned how to get rid of me for good, because I was the only reminder of her old life and the only thing standing in the way of my money. The next day, I came home from school and saw a rusty, beat-up pickup truck sitting in the driveway. Mark was proudly wiping the hood with a rag and announced it was our first investment. I looked at Mom standing next to him, and I knew my money was gone. They had just withdrawn it and bought this piece of junk. Mom walked up to me and tried to hug me, saying things would get better soon and they'd pay me back double. I just pushed her away. I told her I hated both of them and that I was going to sue. That's the moment I saw something click in Mark's eyes. He realized I wasn't going to stay quiet or be convenient. This entire month has been slow-motion torture. I've been living in fear, staying out of the house as much as possible. I started hiding my valuables at a friend's place because I was terrified they'd start selling my electronics next. I'd see Mark whispering to Mom, glancing at my door. They were clearly planning something. Every night at dinner, if they even left me any food, I felt his heavy, triumphant stare on me. He knew he'd won. He knew he owned my mother. And I was just trash that needed to be thrown out. The days following the purchase of that truck were a blur of cold stares and whispered arguments that stopped the second I walked into a room. My house, the place where I used to feel safe, had turned into a minefield where every step I took felt like it could trigger an explosion. I tried to stay away as much as possible, hanging out at the library or sitting in the park until the sun went down, but eventually, I had to go back to the place where my mother was slowly becoming a stranger. Mark didn't just take my money, he was taking my mother's mind, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of the woman who used to bake cookies with me on Sundays. He started telling her that I was the reason they weren't successful yet, that my negative energy and my constant judgment were holding back their business ventures. It sounds insane when I say it out loud, but when you're 15 and the two adults in the house are teamed up against you, you start to feel like you're the one losing your mind. One evening, about 2 weeks into this nightmare, I came home to find Mark sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers and a bottle of cheap bourbon. My mother was standing behind him, rubbing his shoulders like he was some kind of war hero instead of a guy who had just blown $20,000 on a truck that wouldn't even start half the time. They didn't even look up when I walked in, but I could feel the weight of their silence pressing against my chest. Mark finally spoke, his voice low and raspy, telling me that they had looked into my other savings account, the one my grandmother had set up for my emergency expenses. I felt a chill run down my spine because that account was supposed to be private, something only I had the login for. He looked at me with those cold, dead eyes and said that since I was part of this family, I needed to invest that money into the new parts for the truck so they could get the business off the ground. I told him no, and I said it with more courage than I actually felt. I told him that money was all I had left and that I wouldn't give him another dime of what my family had worked for. My mother finally looked at me, but there was no love in her eyes, only a weird, desperate kind of anger. She told me that I was being incredibly selfish and that Mark was doing all of this for us, for our future, and that I was lucky he even wanted to include me. It was like she was reciting a script he had written for her. She actually said that if I didn't want to help the family, maybe I didn't deserve to benefit from the house they were providing for me. That was the first time the threat was made out loud, the first time the idea of me being homeless was dangled in front of me like a punishment for not letting them rob me blind. I spent the next few days in a state of constant panic, trying to figure out how to move my money where they couldn't reach it, but I was a minor and every door I tried to open was locked because I didn't have an adult to sign for me. I felt trapped, watching as my mother sold her engagement ring from my father and her favorite pearl necklace just to buy more equipment for Mark's non-existent company. Every time I tried to talk to her alone, she would just shut down or call for Mark, as if she couldn't even function without his permission. The house started to feel empty, not just because of the missing furniture, but because the soul of it was being sucked out by this man who had appeared out of nowhere and convinced my mother that his failures were actually my fault. Mark started getting more aggressive with his rules, telling me that I wasn't allowed to eat the food in the fridge unless I paid for a share of the groceries. I was 15 years old, working a part-time job at a local cafe just to have enough for lunch at school, and now I was being told I had to pay rent for a room I had lived in my entire life. I would hide granola bars in my school bag and eat them in the bathroom because I was afraid of the confrontation that would happen if I went into the kitchen. I watched the calendar, counting the days, hoping that maybe the month would end and things would go back to normal, but deep down I knew that this was the new normal. Mark was systematically isolating me, turning my mother against me, and making sure that I had nowhere left to turn. He even called my school and told them I was having behavioral issues so that if I complained to a teacher, they would think I was just a troubled kid acting out. He was thorough, I'll give him that. He knew exactly how to dismantle a teenager's life without ever raising his voice in public. I realized then that he wasn't just after the money. He wanted me gone so he could have my mother and our house all to himself. And the worst part was, I could see that she was starting to want that too, just so she wouldn't have to deal with the guilt of what she was doing to me every time she looked at my face. The third week of this nightmare started with a heat wave that made the air in our cramped house feel like it was boiling, and honestly, the physical heat was nothing compared to the absolute coldness I was getting from my mother every single time I tried to speak to her. I remember the walk home that Tuesday so clearly because it was the first time in weeks that I actually felt a tiny spark of hope after my boss at the cafe gave me a $5 tip. And I was thinking that maybe I could buy myself a real dinner instead of hiding in my room with a granola bar. But when I reached the front porch and slid my key into the deadbolt, it wouldn't turn, and for a second I thought I was just being clumsy, or that the humidity had warped the wood. But then I realized the entire hardware had been replaced with a shiny new silver lock. I stood there for a good 2 minutes, just staring at the door handle while my heart started thumping against my ribs so hard I thought I was going to throw up right there on the welcome mat. I started pounding on the door and calling out for my mom, thinking maybe there was some mistake or that they had just gotten a new lock for security reasons and forgot to give me the key. But the house stayed completely silent even though I could see the flicker of the TV reflecting off the living room window. That was when I looked to the side of the porch and saw them 4 heavy-duty black trash bags piled up near the bushes, looking like someone had just cleaned out a garage or a basement. I felt a sick sense of dread as I walked over and ripped the top of the first bag open, and the first thing I saw was my favorite oversized hoodie and the stuffed bear my dad gave me before he left, all shoved in there like actual garbage. They hadn't just changed the locks, they had literally packed up my entire existence into plastic bags and thrown them outside while I was sitting in my 11th grade history class trying to figure out how to pass my finals. I started screaming then, just losing my mind and kicking the door, demanding that my mother come out and look me in the eye. And finally the curtain moved just a tiny bit and I saw her face looking out at me with this expression that I will never forget because it wasn't even angry, it was just empty. Mark appeared behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, leaning down to whisper something in her ear that made her nod. And then he was the one who opened the window just a crack to tell me that I needed to leave before things got ugly. He told me that since I was so independent and didn't want to contribute to the household or support their new business, I was clearly ready to be an adult on my own, and that they had already called the local police station to report a domestic disturbance involving a trespasser. I couldn't believe the words coming out of his mouth, and I looked at my mother, begging her to say something, to tell him he was crazy, to tell me to come inside. But she just stood there like a statue while he told me that they had every right to decide who lived in their home. He said that my attitude was toxic and that I was a financial burden they could no longer afford while they were trying to build a future for themselves, and then he reached out and pulled the window shut and locked it right in my face. I stood there in the driveway with my school backpack still on, surrounded by my clothes and books in trash bags, while the neighbors started peeking through their blinds to see what all the noise was about. The betrayal was so deep that I couldn't even cry at first. I just felt this weird, hollow numbness as I realized that my own mother had chosen a man she barely knew over her own flesh and blood because he had convinced her that I was the enemy. I started dragging the bags toward the sidewalk because I didn't want them touching the grass of a house I wasn't allowed to enter anymore, and that was when a police cruiser actually pulled onto our street, its lights flashing but no siren. 2 officers got out and walked up to me, and I tried to explain that I lived there, that this was my home, but Mark had already called them and told them I was a runaway who was being aggressive and that they were fearful for their safety. The officers looked at me with this pitying look that made me want to scream because they told me that since my mother was the legal owner and I was being provided for with my belongings, they couldn't force her to let me back in if she felt unsafe. They told me I should call a relative or a friend, and they stood there and watched me while I tried to figure out which of my friends would actually take in a girl with 4 bags of trash and no money. Every single thing that had happened in the last month led to this exact moment, and I realized that Mark's plan was finally complete because he had successfully stripped me of my money, my home, and my mother all in the span of 30 days. I sat down on the curb next to my bags, feeling the cold rain start to soak through the plastic, and I watched the lights in the living room go off one by one as they went to bed, leaving me outside like I was nothing more than the trash they had put me in. I spent 3 nights sleeping on the floor of my friend Sarah's room before I realized that I had left my social security card, my birth certificate, and the only photo I had of my biological father in the hidden compartment of my old jewelry box. And I knew that I couldn't start over or even get a legal job without those documents, so I waited until I saw that rusted-out truck rattle out of the driveway on Saturday morning before I crawled through the loose basement window I had purposely left unlatched weeks ago just in case of an emergency. The house smelled like stale beer, cigarette smoke, and that cheap, heavy cologne Mark always wore. And it felt like walking through a graveyard of my own childhood because I could see the empty spots on the walls where our family photos used to hang and the bare spaces in the living room where my mother had sold off our decent furniture to fund Mark's business dreams. I moved like a ghost through the hallway, my heart hammering against my teeth, and when I got to my old room, I saw that they had already turned it into a storage space for the junk Mark was planning to flip, which was basically just broken electronics and old lawnmowers he'd probably stolen from other people's backyards. I found my jewelry box tossed into a corner like it was nothing, and as I grabbed my papers, I noticed a thick manila envelope sitting on the desk that used to be mine. And my curiosity got the better of me because the return address was from a legal firm in a state 300 miles away. I opened it, expecting more bills or debt collection notices, but what I found inside was a set of documents that made the air completely leave my lungs and made the floor feel like it was tilting beneath my feet. It wasn't just about the truck or the startup or the college fund. The papers were a series of new identity applications and a notarized statement from my mother claiming that I had abandoned the home and was missing and presumed to be under the influence of illegal substances, which was a calculated lie designed to strip me of any legal rights to the trust fund or the house. But the real twist, the thing that made me want to scream and vomit at the same time, was a printout of an email chain between my mother and Mark that dated back 6 months, 3 months before they supposedly met at that grocery store. The email showed that my mother hadn't been tricked by a con artist. She had sought him out on a forum for people looking to liquidate family assets without legal interference, and she had literally recruited him to play the role of the new boyfriend so he could be the bad guy, while she pretended to be a victim of her own emotions. She had planned the whole thing, the chance meeting, the quick move-in, the systematic isolation of me, and the eventual lockout, all because she wanted to cash out the house and my inheritance to move to a coastal town where nobody knew her, and she needed a fixer like Mark to handle the dirty work of intimidation. I stood there holding the proof that my own mother had engineered my homelessness as a business transaction, and as I kept digging through the envelope, I found a small GPS tracker and a set of keys to a rental car parked 2 blocks away that wasn't the rusted truck. That was when I found the moral dilemma that stopped me in my tracks. Under the floorboard beneath my old bed, where I used to hide my diary, I found a small metal lockbox that was slightly ajar, and inside was $15,000 in cash, the remainder of my college fund that they hadn't spent yet. I knew if I took that money, I would be a thief in the eyes of the law, and my mother would finally have the proof she needed to tell the police I was a criminal, but if I left it, I would be walking out into the world with nothing but $4 and a backpack full of wet clothes while the woman who gave birth to me used my future to buy herself a new life with a professional predator. I heard a car door slam out front and the heavy, uneven thud of Mark's boots on the porch, and I realized I had less than 30 seconds to decide if I was going to be a victim who stayed pure and broke, or a survivor who took what was hers and risked being a fugitive for the rest of her life. I felt this cold, hard knot tie itself in my stomach as I looked at the cash and then at the window, hearing the key turn in the front door lock, and I realized that the woman inside this house wasn't my mother anymore. She was just another predator. And the only way to survive a predator is to become something even more dangerous. I grabbed the cash and the documents, shoved them into my bag, and dived back out the basement window just as I heard Mark's voice booming through the house, calling out my mother's name to tell her that the deal was moving ahead of schedule. I ran until my lungs felt like they were going to burst, and I didn't stop until I was 5 miles away at a gas station where the fluorescent lights hummed so loudly they drowned out the sound of my own panicking thoughts. I sat in the back of a bus heading toward the city, clutching my backpack to my chest and feeling every single one of those $100 bills pressing against my ribs like a reminder of the life I was leaving behind. I knew that the second Mark realized the cash was gone, he would come after me, and I knew my mother would let him, so I didn't go back to Sarah's house or anywhere else they might think to look for me. I spent the next 2 days hiding in plain sight, moving between 24-hour diners and library basements, using my burner phone to look up the legal names of everyone mentioned in those manila envelope documents. The climax of this whole month didn't happen with a big cinematic explosion or a shouting match. It happened in a quiet, air-conditioned office of a lawyer I found who specialized in family fraud and juvenile advocacy. I sat across from this man, a guy named Mr. Henderson, and I laid out every single piece of evidence I had: the emails where my mother recruited Mark, the fake identity applications, and the notarized lies she told to the state to have me declared a runaway. I told him everything about the college fund and the truck and the way they changed the locks on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at school. Mr. Henderson didn't say much at first, but I saw the way his jaw tightened as he read the email where my mother asked Mark how long it would take to neutralize the kid's legal claim to the house. While the legal wheels started turning, I went back to my neighborhood one last time, not to go inside, but just to watch from the park across the street as the police arrived to serve the warrants. I saw Mark first, coming out the front door with his hands up, looking smaller and more pathetic than he ever did when he was looming over me in the kitchen, and then I saw my mother. She didn't look like a mastermind or a villain. She just looked like a tired, middle-aged woman who had traded her daughter for a chance to run away from her own life. She saw me standing there by the park bench, and for a split second, our eyes met, and I waited for her to look sorry or to look angry or to do anything at all that showed she still cared, but she just turned her head away and got into the back of the patrol car. The resolution wasn't the happy ending people tell you about in movies where everyone learns a lesson and goes back to being a family. My mother is currently facing multiple counts of financial fraud and child endangerment, and Mark is being investigated for a string of similar scams across 3 different states, which means he was never the one for her. He was just the only person who agreed to help her rob me. I'm staying in a state-appointed group home for now because I refused to go to any of my relatives who had sat by and watched my mother fall apart for years without saying a word to help me. The $15,000 I took is currently in a legal escrow account, and while the court says it's technically mine, it feels like blood money that I paid for with the memory of the woman I thought was my best friend. This whole month taught me that you can live in the same house with someone for 15 years and never actually know who they are until there is a $sign attached to your presence. I'm 15 years old and I don't have a home. I don't have a mother, and I don't have a future that feels certain, but I have my name and I have the truth, and in a way, that's more than I had 30 days ago. Sometimes I sit in my new, small room and look at the door, and I catch myself checking to see if the lock has been changed, because the fear doesn't just go away because you won the legal battle. I realize now that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a stranger in a dark alley. It's the person who knows exactly what you love and exactly how to use it to destroy you. My mother got what she wanted. She doesn't have the burden of a daughter anymore, and I got what I needed, which was the realization that I am the only person in this world who is ever truly going to look out for me.